Everyone in Florida had heard the whispers. Some laughed, some scoffed, but most sat in silence, secretly wishing it was true. A bill, a law, an end to every HOA in the state. No more fines for a flower bed, no more late-night threats slipped under doors, no more Karens with clipboards watching your mailbox like it was government property. But why now? Why Florida? And why did it feel like this story wasn't about politics at all, but about the people who had finally had enough? The truth began in neighborhoods most had never noticed. Streets lined with perfect lawns, each blade of grass cut to regulation height. Shutters painted only in 3 approved colors. Houses nearly identical, but behind the walls, families who were tired of living in fear of their own neighbors. And one of them, a man named Daniel, would become the voice that Florida couldn't ignore. Daniel never meant to lead anything. He was just another father moving into a community he thought would be safe for his kids. The brochure promised security, unity, and charm, but within weeks, he learned the fine print meant something darker. They fined him for leaving his trash bin out 2 hours past pickup. They fined his wife for hanging a bird feeder in the backyard. They threatened legal action when his daughter chalked butterflies on the sidewalk. Each letter came with bold red ink. Non-compliance, final warning, the kind of words that made your chest tighten, as if you were a criminal for simply living. Daniel kept quiet at first. He paid the fines. He apologized. He even cut his grass shorter than he liked just to avoid confrontation. But what he didn't realize was that silence only made the HOA hungrier. And then came the night that changed everything. It was just after sunset when Daniel pulled into his driveway. He noticed a small piece of paper taped to his front door. His stomach dropped before he even read it. Another violation. But this one wasn't about his lawn. It was about his son's wheelchair ramp. The letter said it didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. Daniel froze. His hands trembled. His son, 9 years old, unable to walk without the ramp, had finally been able to come in and out of the house with dignity. And now the HOA wanted it gone. Something inside Daniel broke. That night, instead of writing a check, he opened his laptop. He wrote a post. He told the story of his family, his son, and the neighborhood that cared more about paint colors than a child's independence. He didn't know who would read it, but by morning the post had spread farther than he imagined. Thousands of shares, thousands of comments, and one question that kept echoing. Why are HOAs allowed to treat people this way? Florida lawmakers noticed. News anchors repeated Daniel's words, and in a state that had grown tired of HOA horror stories, the late fees, the bullying, the lawsuits that drained savings, something began to shift. But Daniel's story wasn't the only one. Behind every like, every comment, was another neighbor with scars of their own. The woman fined for parking her car in her own driveway. The veteran forced to take down a flag because it wasn't the right size. The elderly man threatened with foreclosure over weeds he couldn't pull fast enough. One by one, the stories built a storm, and at the center of it all was a question no politician could dodge forever. Was it time to end HOAs entirely? The hearings began quietly, tucked inside government buildings that most residents never set foot in. But the people came anyway, mothers carrying stacks of violation letters, fathers holding photos of their kids, veterans in worn caps, teachers with tired eyes. They filled the seats, the aisles, even the hallways. Lawmakers sat stiff, but even they could feel the tension. The air was heavy with something rare in politics, raw, unfiltered humanity. And then came Daniel, nervous, sweating. His voice cracked as he spoke about his son. But when he lifted that violation letter into the microphone light, the silence in the room turned electric. No one breathed, no one whispered, because at that moment it wasn't just about one man or one family. It was about every person who had ever been told that their home wasn't really theirs. What no one knew yet was that Daniel's testimony would ignite something larger than any HOA had ever faced. A movement that would divide communities, threaten millions in property investments, and question the very idea of control in neighborhoods across America. And in the shadows of Florida's manicured streets, HOA presidents began to panic. Because for the first time, it wasn't the homeowners who were afraid. It was them. The first shock came not from lawmakers, but from the HOA boards themselves. For years they had ruled unchecked, confident no homeowner would ever dare challenge them. But when Daniel's testimony reached the news, their fortress cracked. Emails began to leak, presidents of associations warning their members to stay quiet. Attorneys whispering that if Florida passed this law, entire property management companies would collapse overnight. It wasn't just a bill anymore, it was survival. And survival makes people desperate. One night Daniel received an envelope. No stamp, no return address. Just slid under his door like a threat in a crime drama. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 5 words scrawled in black ink. "You don't know the cost." Daniel stared at it. His wife begged him to take it to the police. But what could he say? That neighbors, the same ones who waved politely at him in daylight, were sending midnight threats. He tucked the letter away in a drawer, pretending it was nothing. But inside, he knew this fight was already darker than he had imagined. Meanwhile, the state hearings grew louder. Each day, new homeowners stepped forward. A retired nurse broke down as she described losing her savings to HOA legal fees. A single mother whispered about how her board threatened to foreclose over Christmas lights. A young couple showed photos of a playground torn down because it was approved. The lawmakers listened. Some leaned back, frowning, already calculating votes. Others shifted in their seats, caught between donors and the undeniable truth rising from ordinary voices. And through it all, the question loomed. Could Florida, the land of gated communities, condos, and pristine developments, really erase HOAs from its future? But every movement has resistance, and this one had powerful enemies. In glossy offices high above the Florida coast, lobbyists gathered. They represented real estate giants, property investors, even construction firms. To them, HOAs weren't a nuisance, they were profit. Order meant higher property values. Fines meant revenue. Control meant money. "Eliminate HOAs," one lobbyist snapped, "and you destabilize the entire housing market." They planned a counterattack. Ads rolled out across Florida. Smooth voices on radios warning that without HOAs, neighborhoods would collapse into chaos. Billboards appeared showing overgrown lawns, broken fences, graffiti-covered homes, fear painted 20 feet high. "Without HOAs," the slogan read, "this could be your street." And for a moment it worked. Some residents, unsure, began to worry. What if the bill went too far? What if HOAs, as cruel as they were the only thing keeping neighborhoods from falling apart? Doubts spread like smoke. But then another story surfaced. An elderly veteran named Mr. Collins stood outside a courthouse, his hands shaking as he held a foreclosure notice. His crime? Installing a small ramp for his wife, who could no longer walk stairs. The HOA had fined him daily until the debt crushed him. Cameras caught his tears as he whispered, "I fought for freedom. I never thought I'd lose it to my own neighbors." That clip went viral, millions watched, and suddenly the bill was no longer just policy, it was morality. Back in Daniel's neighborhood, the HOA doubled down. They started inspecting his yard every week, measuring his fence height, photographing his car. They fined him for a garden hose left out overnight. They called his ramp unauthorized construction. But what they didn't understand was this. Every fine only made Daniel stronger. He posted each notice online, attaching it to his growing audience. Thousands of comments poured in, thousands of voices rallying behind him. What once was fear became fire. And then came the rally. It began small outside the Capitol in Tallahassee. A few dozen homeowners holding signs. "Homes, not handcuffs. End the HOA tyranny." But as the hours passed, the crowd swelled. Hundreds, then thousands, families, veterans, teachers, retirees. They filled the streets, chanting so loud that lawmakers inside could hear them through the glass. Reporters swarmed, cameras rolled, and when Daniel stepped onto the steps of the Capitol, his son at his side, the crowd fell silent. His boy gripped the railing of his wheelchair ramp, his eyes scanning the sea of faces. Daniel didn't give a speech. He just held up one of the violation letters and tore it in half. The sound of paper ripping echoed like thunder. The crowd erupted. Inside, lawmakers shifted uneasily. They had planned to stall the bill, bury it in committees, drown it in legal language. But this was a movement they could not ignore. Still in the shadows, the HOAs were plotting. They weren't just going to sit back and watch decades of power vanish. Rumors spread of lawsuits, of emergency injunctions, of entire communities ready to revolt. And then came a chilling discovery. Late one evening, Daniel logged into his bank account. His mortgage company had sent a notice. According to their system, he was 3 months behind on payments, but Daniel knew he was. He had proof, receipts, transfers. Someone had tampered with his records. The message was clear. They weren't just going to fight him in court or in politics. They were going to come for his home itself. Daniel sat in the dark, staring at the glowing screen. His son asleep upstairs, his wife trying to stay strong, and he asked himself the question every viewer now whispered. Was one man really strong enough to take down the entire system? The answer wasn't clear, but what was clear was this. The war over HOAs in Florida had only just begun, and the next battle would be unlike anything anyone had seen before. Because this wasn't just about lawns or ramps or trash cans. It was about who really owned your home, you or them. The sun rose over Florida with a strange quiet the morning after the mortgage notice. Daniel hadn't slept. His laptop screen still glowed in the corner of the room, frozen on that cruel message. Delinquent, foreclosure proceedings imminent. How do you explain something like that to your wife? To your children? That the house they lived in, the house where his son's laughter still echoed in the walls, was suddenly in jeopardy, not because he had failed, but because someone wanted to break him. Daniel didn't speak at breakfast. He watched his kids eat cereal, watched his wife pack lunches, and tried to hide the storm in his chest. But she noticed. She always noticed. "What is it?" she asked softly, her hand brushing his. He hesitated, the words burned in his throat. Finally, he whispered, "They're coming for the house." Her spoon froze. For a moment, the clatter of the kitchen stopped. She shook her head, refusing to believe. But Daniel pushed the laptop toward her, and when her eyes landed on the notice, her face drained of color. And in that silence, the truth hit them both. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was war. Later that day, Daniel sat across from a lawyer. The office smelled like paper and dust, but the man's voice was sharp. "If what you're saying is true," he said, tapping the notice, "then this isn't just HOA retaliation. This is fraud, and fraud leaves fingerprints." But Daniel knew what the lawyer didn't. HOAs had money, lawyers, influence. They had systems built to outlast ordinary families. If this fight stayed in the shadows, they would lose everything. So Daniel made a choice. He would not hide this. He would show the world. That night he recorded a video. No fancy edits. Just him sitting at his kitchen table, violation letters stacked in front of him like trophies of pain. He held up the foreclosure notice, his hands trembling but his voice steady. "They're not just fining us anymore," he said. "They're trying to erase us. If they can do this to me, they can do it to you. This isn't just about HOAs, this is about who owns our homes, and I'm not backing down." The video spread like wildfire. By morning it had 1 million views, by noon 2 million. Hashtags exploded across social media, End HOA, Our Homes, Florida Freedom. And for the first time, lawmakers who had been silent began to speak. Some cautiously, others boldly. A senator tweeted, "No family should lose their home because of HOA abuse. It's time for change." But while the movement grew, so did the danger. A neighbor pulled Daniel aside one evening, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he whispered. "These boards, they're connected. Property managers, attorneys, even banks. If you think they'll just let this bill pass, you're wrong. Be careful." Daniel wanted to laugh it off, but deep down, he felt the truth in those words. Every step forward seemed to awaken something darker. And then the sabotage began. His mailbox was pried open, letters scattered in the rain, his car tires slashed, anonymous calls at midnight, silent except for breathing. His wife's workplace received a complaint about her unprofessional conduct, even though she had done nothing wrong. It was intimidation, plain and cruel, But Daniel kept posting. Each threat, each act of vandalism became another chapter in his growing archive of proof, and the more he shared, the more people rallied. Meanwhile, in Tallahassee, the hearings intensified. Lawmakers who had once rolled their eyes at the bill now faced packed chambers. The testimonies grew rower, harsher. One man recounted how his HOA sued him for planting a vegetable garden to feed his family. A teacher broke down describing how she lost her home over a $150 late fee. The air was electric, but beneath it all lurked a single question. Would any of this matter when the lobbyists wrote the checks? Because behind closed doors, the opposition was mounting. Lobbyists offered campaign contributions in exchange for votes. Real estate developers warned of economic disaster. Attorneys whispered threats of lawsuits that could tie the state up for decades. And in the middle of it all was Daniel, a man who had never wanted to be anyone's hero. But he wasn't alone anymore. One night after speaking at a town hall, an elderly woman approached him. Her hands shook as she handed him a faded folder. Inside were decades of HOA violation letters, fines, threats, even a foreclosure order. "They took my house," she whispered. "I want you to have this. Maybe you can stop them before they take someone else." Daniel held the folder like it was made of glass. And in that moment, he understood something. This wasn't just about his family. It was about every family that had been silenced, every homeowner who had been broken. The movement wasn't his anymore. It belonged to all of them. But the HOAs weren't finished. The very next week, news broke of a lawsuit filed against Daniel himself. The claim? Defamation. His videos, they argued, were damaging to the reputation of the HOA. They demanded hundreds of thousands in damages. The headlines blared, "HOA sues father leading anti-HOA movement." It was a trap. If he fought in court, the legal fees could bury him. If he backed down, the movement would crumble. And yet Daniel didn't flinch. He stood before cameras, his voice steady, his son at his side. "They want to scare me into silence," he said. "But I'm not afraid, because for every letter they've sent me, I've received 1,000 more from people just like me. We're not the problem, we're the homeowners, and we're done being silent." The crowd behind him roared. The movement surged again, but Daniel knew what was coming next. The HOAs had played their opening hand. The real war, legal, political, personal, was only beginning. And as the bill inched closer to a vote, one thought haunted everyone watching. Would Florida really become the first state to ban HOAs? Or would the machine crush Daniel before the truth could ever reach the light? Everyone thought the lawsuit would break him. That was the HOA's plan. Bury Daniel in paperwork, drown him in legal fees, and paint him as a reckless father leading an angry mob. But what they hadn't counted on was how much the world was watching. The day of the first hearing, Daniel walked into the courthouse not alone, but flanked by dozens of neighbors holding signs. "We stand with Daniel. Homes are human. Stop HOA abuse." Cameras flashed, reporters swarmed, and suddenly, what should have been a quiet procedural meeting turned into front-page news. Inside, the HOA's lawyers smirked, armed with binders thicker than phone books. But when Daniel's attorney placed just one folder on the table, everyone leaned in. It wasn't filled with defenses. It was filled with stories. Violation letters, fines, photos, testimonies from dozens of families who had suffered the same treatment. Each page another scar carved into Florida's neighborhoods. And when the judge glanced over the first few, his brow furrowed. "This case," he said slowly, "is not just about one man. It appears to touch hundreds, perhaps thousands of Florida residents." That single line was enough to shift the air. The HOA attorneys stiffened, because they knew this wasn't going to be the quick, quiet takedown they had planned. Outside, the crowd cheered, but Daniel didn't smile. He knew the fight was far from over. Because as soon as the hearing ended, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "Drop this or lose everything." He showed it to his wife later that night. Her hands shook, but her eyes held steady. "They're scared," she whispered. "That means you're winning." But winning came with a cost. Bills piled up. His wife picked up extra shifts. The kids overheard whispers about money, about moving, about losing the house. Daniel tried to shield them, but even children can sense when the walls of their world begin to tremble. Still, he pressed on. He traveled across the state, speaking at rallies, listening to stories that mirrored his own. Each night he returned home more exhausted, but also more determined, because every hand he shook, every tear he saw, reminded him why he couldn't stop. And then one evening, something unexpected happened. A lawmaker, one who had publicly opposed the bill, asked to meet him privately. They sat in a quiet cafe away from cameras. The man leaned in, his voice low. "You're winning hearts," he said. "But you need to know the lobbyists aren't done. They've spent millions to kill this bill. If you're not careful, they'll turn the public against you. They're building a campaign right now, painting you as dangerous, as unstable. They want to make you the villain." Daniel listened, his jaw tight. "So what do I do?" The lawmaker's eyes were weary. "Tell the truth, but be ready, because they'll use every lie they can to silence you." And soon the lies began. Local news stations ran stories about Daniel being unhinged. Anonymous sources claimed he was fabricating violation letters. A fake social media account appeared, pretending to be a former neighbor, spreading rumors about his family. The smear campaign was brutal, but Daniel's supporters countered with proof, videos, documents, photos. Every lie was met with truth, every rumor with evidence. And in that tug of war, the public grew more invested than ever. By now, the bill had a name, the Homeowner Freedom Act. And its first committee vote was only days away. The night before, Daniel stood outside the Capitol, staring at its towering white pillars. Hundreds of families had gathered again, candles flickering in the humid Florida air. A quiet prayer spread through the crowd, not religious but human. A plea for dignity, for freedom, for the chance to live without fear in their own homes. Daniel held his son's hand. The boy looked up at him and whispered, "Dad, will we be okay?" For a moment, Daniel couldn't answer. He knelt, looking into his son's eyes, and with all the weight of the world pressing on his shoulders, he said, "I don't know, but I promise you this, we won't stop fighting." The next morning, the committee room was packed. Lawmakers sat stiff, papers spread before them. Lobbyists whispered in corners. Reporters filled the back rows. And in the front sat Daniel, his wife beside him, their son's wheelchair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The testimonies began. HOA representatives spoke of order, of property values, of community standards. Their words were polished, practiced, but the crowd shifted uneasily. Then came the homeowners. One after another, their voices cracked with emotion. A man who lost his home over a $200 fine. A mother whose HOA banned her child's therapy swings. A widow fined for leaving her porch light on for safety. The room grew heavy with silence, broken only by the steady scratching of pens. Finally, Daniel stood. He held up the foreclosure notice again, the same paper that had haunted his nights. "This is what they do," he said, his voice steady. "This is how they break us, but today you get to decide if this continues or if Florida will be the first state to say enough." The vote was called. One by one, lawmakers spoke. Yes, yes, no, yes. The tally board lit up. The Homeowner Freedom Act passed its first committee. The room erupted. Cheers, sobs, applause. Daniel's wife clutched his hand, tears streaming down her face. His son smiled, the kind of smile that made the sleepless nights worth it. But deep down, Daniel knew this was only the beginning. Because for every yes today, there would be 10 no's tomorrow. The lobbyists would fight harder. The HOAs would strike dirtier. And the war over Florida's neighborhoods was about to spill into the open in ways no one had ever seen. And in the dark hallways of power, voices whispered one chilling truth. If Florida succeeds, every other state might follow. And that was something the HOA machine would never allow without a fight. The victory should have felt sweet. The Homeowner Freedom Act had survived its first hurdle, but Daniel barely slept that night. Every win brought a heavier shadow, and he could feel it pressing closer. The morning after the committee vote, the headlines screamed his name. Some called him a hero, others painted him as reckless. But one headline in bold black print froze him where he stood. Father who wants to end HOAs, funded by out-of-state extremists. The article was a lie built on half-truths and fabrications. It claimed Daniel had secret donors, that he wasn't a victim but a political pawn. And though the story collapsed under scrutiny, the damage was done. Doubt spread. Was he really just a father fighting for his son, or something more calculated? That was the point. The HOAs didn't need to win every argument. They just needed to muddy the waters. At dinner, Daniel's daughter looked up from her plate. "Daddy, are we bad people?" The question shattered him. He forced a smile, reassured her, but inside he felt the weight of every smear, every lie. This wasn't just about laws anymore. It was about his family's very dignity. Meanwhile, the battle lines stretched beyond Florida. National news picked up the story. Commentators argued on TV. Were HOAs necessary safeguards against chaos or tyrannies dressed in khakis and clipboards? Other states began to watch. Petitions appeared in Texas, Arizona, Nevada, states with sprawling HOA communities. If Florida passed the law, it could ignite a chain reaction. Property markets, billions of dollars, entire industries stood at stake. And that's when the threats grew sharper. Late one evening, Daniel was driving home when headlights filled his rearview mirror. Too close, too aggressive. He changed lanes. The car followed. His pulse quickened. For 2 miles it tailed him, swerving closer, flashing its brights. Only when he reached his neighborhood did the car finally peel away into the night. He sat in the driveway, hands gripping the wheel, sweat on his brow. He realized this wasn't paranoia anymore. Someone wanted to scare him into silence. But Daniel refused to stop. The next hearing was bigger, broadcast live. Families across the state tuned in. And the HOAs, desperate, unleashed their most powerful weapon yet, fear. An association president stood at the podium, her voice calm but her words chilling. "If you eliminate HOAs, neighborhoods will collapse, property values will plummet, crime will rise, your American dream will turn into a nightmare." She held up photos of abandoned houses, graffiti, broken fences. None of them were from Florida, but no one in the room could prove it in the moment. The effect was immediate. Gasps, murmurs, doubt rippling through the chamber. Daniel knew he had to act. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't bring charts or graphs. He brought his son. The boy rolled forward in his wheelchair, looking small under the bright lights. "This," Daniel said, his hand resting on his son's shoulder, "is who they find me for. Not for weeds, not for paint, for giving my child dignity. If you think eliminating HOAs will bring chaos, ask yourself this. What kind of order finds a child for needing a ramp?" The room went silent. Even the most hardened lawmakers looked away, ashamed. But silence wasn't victory. The vote ended in a deadlock. The bill was stalled, hanging by a thread. That night, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, head in his hands. He had poured everything into this fight, his savings, his safety, his peace of mind. And now, with the nation watching, it felt like the movement could crumble at any moment. Then came a knock at the door. He opened it to find a group of neighbors, not just from his street, from across Florida. They carried boxes, folders, even videotapes. One man, a retired postal worker, set down a stack so heavy it bent the porch rail. "These are our stories," he said. "Use them." Daniel blinked. "Why me?" "Because you're the only one they can't silence." He carried the boxes inside, his living room filling with paper and plastic, decades of hidden abuse spilling across the floor. Letters threatening foreclosure, photos of playgrounds demolished, audio recordings of board members laughing about fines. It was overwhelming, but it was also the weapon he needed. The next day, Daniel released a documentary-style video. Raw, unpolished, but undeniable. He read the letters aloud, his voice shaking. He showed the photos, the recordings, the proof. No actors, no edits, just the truth in all its ugliness. And it broke the internet. Millions watched, millions shared, and suddenly the narrative shifted. No longer was this about Daniel versus an HOA. It was about Florida versus an entire system built on fear and profit. Lawmakers felt the ground shift beneath them. Lobbyists scrambled. HOA boards held emergency meetings. And in living rooms across the state, ordinary people whispered the same thing. If Florida can do this, maybe we can too. But in the shadows, the opposition grew more dangerous. The lawsuit against Daniel intensified, draining his savings. Anonymous threats turned into vandalism. A brick shattered his living room window one night, a note tied to it, "Stop or else." His wife begged him to consider stepping back. "They're putting targets on us," she said through tears. Daniel took her hands, his voice breaking. "If I quit now, they win, not just here, everywhere." Because deep down, he knew something that terrified him. This wasn't just about Florida anymore. This was about America. And the question hanging over every headline, every protest, every whispered conversation in every cul-de-sac was this: could one man, one movement, really dismantle an empire built in the shadows of the suburbs? Or would the empire crush him first? The night after the brick shattered his window, Daniel found himself packing in the dark, his bare feet crunching across glass shards. His children were upstairs, trembling in their beds, afraid of noises outside. His wife pressed the curtains shut, whispering for him to call the police. But the police were no help. The HOA lobby had allies everywhere. The responding officer took one look at the note tied to the brick and shrugged. "Probably just kids messing around," he muttered. "File a report, but don't expect much." Daniel clenched his jaw. It wasn't kids. This was coordinated. The enemy was tightening its grip. The next morning, the headlines spun again. "Pro-HOA families targeted by harassment," one article claimed, complete with staged photos of victims, claiming Daniel's movement was behind the violence. It was a lie, but a dangerous one. He could feel support wavering. His phone buzzed nonstop with messages. "Is this true? Did your people do this?" He typed replies until his thumbs ached. "No, they're framing us. Stay strong." But he knew lies traveled faster than truth. That week, the battle took its most vicious turn yet. The HOA coalition launched a multi-million-dollar campaign ad. On TV screens across Florida, slick images flashed, children playing in pristine parks, manicured lawns glowing under golden sunlight. Then came the warning: without HOAs, your neighborhoods will collapse, criminals will move in, property values will vanish. Don't let one angry man destroy your community. The ad ended with Daniel's face, grainy, shadowed, as if he were a criminal himself. His daughter saw it during a cartoon break. She turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "Daddy, why do they hate us?" Daniel hugged her, choking back tears. "Because we scare them, because we tell the truth." But the truth was becoming harder to hold on to. Bills piled up. The lawsuit drained his savings. And now, even some neighbors who once supported him avoided eye contact, fearful of being targeted next. Still, Daniel pressed on. The next hearing was unlike any before. The Capitol steps overflowed with people, HOA defenders in polo shirts on one side, angry families with homemade signs on the other. Television cameras captured every chant, every shove, every shouted word. Inside the chamber, the tension was unbearable. One senator leaned close to Daniel and whispered, "You're playing with fire. Back down before someone gets burned." But Daniel didn't back down. He stood at the podium, voice steady despite the storm in his chest. "Look around this room," he said. "This isn't about lawns. This isn't about fences. This is about power. Do you want your neighborhoods run by elected leaders accountable to the people, or by boards accountable only to themselves?" The chamber erupted. Cheers and boos tangled together in a roar that shook the walls. And then something unexpected happened. From the back row, a man in a gray suit rose slowly to his feet. Daniel recognized him instantly. He was no senator, no lawmaker. He was a former HOA president from South Florida, infamous for running his community like a fiefdom until lawsuits forced him to resign. But now, with cameras rolling, the man's face was pale. His hands trembled as he spoke. I was wrong," he admitted. "I fined people into foreclosure, I ruined lives, and the system rewarded me for it. He's right. This has to end." Gasps rippled through the room. For the first time, the armor of the HOA empire cracked in public. But victory never came without a price. That night, Daniel's car was rammed off the road. He survived with bruises and a shattered windshield, but his wife's scream still echoed in his ears. She begged him again. "Please, Daniel, stop this before they kill you." He couldn't answer, not because he didn't hear her, but because deep down he already knew the truth. The fight had gone too far to turn back. And then came the subpoena. A thick envelope hand-delivered to his door. Not just a lawsuit anymore, a federal investigation. Allegations of fraud, tax evasion, misuse of funds, all fabricated but deadly serious. His lawyer spread the papers across the kitchen table, shaking his head. "They're trying to bury you alive in paperwork. Even if you're innocent, this could take years." Daniel leaned forward, his voice low but fierce. "Then we don't give them years, we finish this fight now." He knew what had to be done. The next phase couldn't just be about hearings and speeches. It had to be about exposing everything. Every hidden bylaw, every shadow account, every board member who had used fines as a weapon. So with his small band of allies, Daniel launched the Sunshine Project, a digital archive of evidence, open to the public. Thousands of homeowners submitted documents, photos, testimonies. The site exploded overnight, servers crashing under the weight of truth. And with each upload, the empire grew weaker. The HOAs panicked. They tried to shut the site down. They called it illegal, defamatory. But the genie was out of the bottle. The more they pushed, the faster the files spread, copied across servers, mirrored on social media, printed and handed out like underground pamphlets. It was no longer just Daniel's fight. It was everyone's. But the more the truth spread, the more dangerous it became. Daniel knew with a sick certainty that the people who had rammed his car wouldn't stop there. And so he sat at his desk one night, staring at a letter he had written to his family. A letter that began with 3 words he prayed they'd never have to read. "If I fall," because the question haunting him now was if the empire would strike again. It was when. They said it couldn't be done. They said HOAs were untouchable, too deeply rooted, too powerful to fail. But by the time the Sunshine Project had reached its second week, something impossible began to happen. Whispers turned into headlines. Local news stations that once mocked Daniel were suddenly reporting, cautiously, about alleged abuses inside Florida HOAs. Lawmakers who had dodged his calls were now demanding emergency hearings. And then came the twist no one saw coming. A leaked memo. It arrived in Daniel's inbox at 3:14 a.m., anonymous, no subject line, no signature. Attached was a single PDF, stamped with the logo of the Florida HOA Council. At first glance, it looked like another boring internal document, but then Daniel read the first page, and his stomach dropped. The memo was a strategy plan, a master playbook written months earlier, long before the ban was even proposed. Its title was blunt: Operation Preservation. Inside, it revealed everything: coordinated donations to politicians, scripted testimony for fake homeowner witnesses, plans to smear whistleblowers like Daniel, even a budget line for security operations, the very same operations, Daniel realized, that had nearly cost him his life on the highway. But buried on the 3rd page was the real bombshell. A section labeled Federal Lobby Support. It listed names, not local board members, not lawyers, but senators, governors, even real estate giants. The HOA empire wasn't just a neighborhood issue, it was tied to the highest levels of power, money, and land. Daniel printed the memo, his hands trembling. For weeks, he had thought he was fighting crooked boards and predatory lawyers. But now, staring at that paper, he realized the truth. He wasn't just fighting HOAs, he was fighting the machine that built them. And the machine would stop at nothing. The morning after the memo leak, Daniel tried to reach his lawyer. No answer. He drove to the office only to find the door locked, the lights off, the nameplate removed, vanished overnight. His phone rang, an unfamiliar number. He answered. A voice, calm but sharp as broken glass, spoke. Mr. Ramirez, you've made your point. Shut it down, take your family and disappear, or the next accident won't miss. The line went dead. For a long moment, Daniel just sat in his car, gripping the wheel until his knuckles turned white. His heart thundered. He thought of his wife, his children, their laughter, their fear. He thought of the letter he had written, "If I fall." Was this the end? But then a memory hit him. His daughter looking up at him after seeing that cruel ad on TV. "Daddy, why do they hate us?" "Because we scare them." And for the first time, Daniel smiled. A tired, broken, but defiant smile. If they were this afraid, it meant he was winning. That night he went live, not through news channels, not filtered through hearings, but directly, raw and unedited to the people. A live stream from his kitchen table, the memo spread out in front of him. Tens of thousands joined within minutes. By midnight, it was hundreds of thousands. His voice shook at first, but then grew steadier. "They tried to silence me. They tried to kill me. They painted me as a criminal, but tonight I show you the truth they don't want you to see." He held the memo up to the camera. Page after page, he read aloud, letting the world hear the machine's own words. Viewers flooded the chat with outrage, disbelief, fury. And then came something no one expected. Lawmakers joined the stream. Senators, representatives. Their usernames popped up in the live chat, demanding copies of the document. It was undeniable. It was real. By morning, the memo was everywhere, on news sites, on social feeds, printed in coffee shops, projected on the side of buildings. Florida was on fire with truth. But with truth came danger. That evening, black SUVs idled outside Daniel's home. His wife watched from the window, her hands shaking. Men in suits stepped out, scanning the street, speaking into earpieces. Were they government, HOA contractors, something darker? Daniel didn't know. He only knew one thing: there was no going back. The next day, Florida's governor called for an emergency vote. Not in weeks, not in months, tomorrow. The state would decide, once and for all, if HOAs had a future. Daniel barely slept that night. He lay awake, listening to every creak of the floorboards, every car door outside. His wife dozed fitfully beside him, murmuring his name in her sleep. His children clutched stuffed animals, unaware of how close the storm had come to their doorstep. And just before dawn, as the sun painted the sky in bruised shades of purple and gray, Daniel whispered to himself, "This is it." Because he knew the vote wouldn't just decide the fate of HOAs. It would decide the fate of his family, his future, and the truth itself. The sun rose over Tallahassee like it knew history was waiting. Streets that were quiet yesterday now roared with voices, families holding handmade signs, HOA loyalists waving corporate banners, TV vans parked bumper to bumper. The state capitol looked less like a building and more like the front line of a war. Daniel walked slowly up the marble steps, his family close behind him. His wife squeezed his hand until it hurt, but he didn't let go. His children stayed pressed against his side, their small eyes wide at the sight of the crowd. Inside, the chamber was standing room only. Reporters jammed into the aisles, their cameras already rolling. Lawmakers filled their seats with grim faces, the leaked memo clutched in their folders. And at the center, the governor's chair, unsmiling, watchful. When Daniel was called to the podium, he felt the weight of every step. His chest ached. His throat was dry. He thought of every threat, every sleepless night, every glass shard swept from his children's bedroom floor. He thought of the letter tucked into his coat pocket, "If I fall." He looked out across the chamber, across Florida, and spoke. "They told me I was just one man. They told me no one cared. They told me I would be destroyed for speaking out. Maybe they were right. Maybe I should have stayed quiet. But then I saw families crying over foreclosure notices. I saw neighbors fined until they lost their homes. I saw power twisted into cruelty, and I couldn't stay quiet anymore." The chamber was silent. Even the cameras seemed to lean closer. Today you have a choice. You can protect the few who profit from fear, or you can protect the many who live with it every day. You can side with empire, or you can side with people, but you cannot do both. His voice broke, he let it, because truth wasn't always polished, sometimes it was raw. When he stepped down, his daughter ran into his arms, whispering, "You did it, Daddy." And then the vote began. Names were called one by one. Each aye was met with cheers, each no with hisses. The count swung back and forth, too close to predict. Cameras zoomed in on sweating brows, shaking hands, whispered last-minute deals. Then the final senator stood, a man long tied to HOA lobby money. For weeks, everyone assumed his vote was locked. He paused, he looked down at the memo on his desk, and then, with a voice that carried across the chamber, he said, "Zly." The room erupted. Cheers thundered against marble walls. People sobbed, shouted, lifted their children into the air. Reporters bolted for cameras. Lawmakers clutched their heads in disbelief. It was done. Florida had voted to dismantle HOAs. The empire had fallen. But even in victory, the cost was clear. As Daniel left the chamber, his lawyer, the one who vanished, appeared at the edge of the crowd. His expression was hard, warning. "You don't know what you've started," he muttered before disappearing again. Because empires never truly die in a single day. They retreat, they wait, they build again in shadows. Daniel knew this. He knew the fight wasn't over, not really, but tonight he had won something undeniable, hope. Back home, his daughter fell asleep on the couch with the TV still on, the news anchor's voice repeating. Florida becomes first state in the nation to abolish HOAs. His wife curled against him, whispering, "It's finally over." He kissed her hair, holding her close, but his eyes stayed fixed on the window, watching the street, listening for footsteps, headlights, engines in the night. Because he knew victory wasn't safety. Victory was just survival bought one day at a time. And yet, for the first time in months, he allowed himself to breathe, to believe. He stepped outside onto his porch. The night air was heavy with summer heat, but the stars shone clear. He thought of the thousands who had marched beside him, the strangers who had sent him documents, the families who had lifted their voices. This wasn't just his story anymore. It belonged to all of them. Sometimes empires fall not with a sword, but with a whisper that grows too loud to ignore. And sometimes the bravest thing a man can do isn't fighting for power, but fighting so others don't have to. As the wind rustled through the trees and the hum of distant cars faded, Daniel closed his eyes and whispered the words he had carried all along. "If I fall, let it be because I stood for something." And for the first time, he no longer feared falling. Because Florida had risen. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.